Hey guys, Alex Newman here with the New American. We are at the COP30 in Berlin, and we're here with Romain Loulalen. He is the Global Policy Director for Oil Change International, one of the major groups here that's advocating for a transition away from fossil fuels. Romain, thanks for being with us. Talk to us about why you think it's important to transition away from fossil fuels.
Well, the first reason is because fossil fuels account for more than 80% of global CO2 emissions, and you cannot have negotiations to tackle climate change without tackling the root cause of climate change, which is our continued dependence on oil, coal, and gas. That seems impossible. So that's the very first thing. And the second thing is there's a lot of countries that want to do their transition away from fossil fuels. In these negotiations, they've expressed that, but they need the finance to be able to do that. And so these negotiations should ideally help them in trying to secure that finance to, gain energy access and transition to clean energy. And so that's why we're pushing for these negotiations to talk about what we call a just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels, because not only do you need finance, but you also need the rich countries that still produce a lot of oil and gas, in particular the US, but also Canada, Norway, and Australia, etc., to phase out first.
And so I'm sure you hear this a lot, but is it really feasible to get rid of fossil fuels? I mean, the whole economy is dependent on it, transportation, agriculture. How does that look? I mean, how does it work? New technologies? I mean, how do we move from where we are now to that?
Well, I think it's absolutely feasible. Renewable energy, solar, wind have become increasingly cheap in large parts of the world. Even in countries where there's no subsidies for them, you see, because they've become so cheap, they're being deployed at unprecedented scale, right? So that's for the power sector. Then you have solutions in other sectors. We're not saying we're going to get rid of fossil fuels overnight, right? That's not what the conversation is about. The conversation is how we're going to plan for a transition away from fossil fuels that's orderly, so that doesn't leave people without power, that doesn't skyrocket energy prices, but also look at the need of people and communities to have access to clean energy, to stop being polluted by fossil fuels, etc. So no one is saying we're going to turn off the tap overnight, but the more we wait, the faster we're going to have to turn off the tap. So that's why we want this discussion to happen very, very rapidly.
Yeah, so a couple years ago at the COP in Dubai, they did officially agree, at least, that they're going to phase out fossil fuels. But it seems now like there's been some backing away. They're currently negotiating the text, and my understanding is the current one doesn't even have that language in it anymore. Do you think governments are backtracking a little bit on their commitments from Dubai? And also, of course, the Trump administration now has made pretty clear that they actually call this the biggest con job in the history of humanity. Where do you think we are in that process? Do you still think it's realistic that governments are going to get there?
I mean, it's true that the politics or the geopolitics have changed tremendously since Dubai 2 years ago. Obviously, as you said, the US, the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, is no longer in these talks, so that's a problem, obviously. But we're also seeing a whole lot of countries coming out in press conferences, in meetings, and in the plenary or in the negotiations here, really making it clear that they will not leave these negotiations without an outcome on fossil fuels. So that's really encouraging. So there's a lot of narratives on backtracking, on climate, of countries not caring anymore, and that's not what we're seeing here. But we're seeing it's difficult because, again, there's tens and tens of countries in Africa and elsewhere that are stuck in their dependency on fossil fuels because they have a lot of sovereign debt, because they don't see any finance coming from rich countries to help them transition away. And so they're being asked again and again to do more on fossil fuels, on energy, etc., without having the support, the financial support that they need to do that. And so the European Union in particular now, because it's the biggest bloc of rich countries in these negotiations, they can say fossil fuel phase out until they're blue in the face, but until they put the money on the table that tens and tens of countries need to do this transition, it's not going to happen, and these negotiations are going to remain tense. So it's the responsibility of these rich countries now to actually show that they're hearing the concerns from developing countries and are willing to help them do this in a just way.
So turning now to communist China, one of the big criticisms from the American president is that communist China keeps building coal-fired power plants, and I guess their CO2 footprint is like 300% of the American one. And he has said, even going back to 2012, he said this is a hoax to benefit the communist Chinese. What do you do about countries like communist China? Do you think they're going to jump on board with this? And what does that look like? I mean, their footprint is still going up and up and up. How does that process happen with a government like China?
Well, I think the first thing to say about China is that for a country that's still, growing its economy, that's still developing, their emissions are actually flat now because they're deploying so much solar and so much wind, like at a rate that's unprecedented in human history. They're actually, despite a large population and large energy needs, actually they're starting to plateau their emissions. And I think the United States, in particular, has no lesson to give anyone when it comes to getting out of fossil fuels. It is the largest producer of oil and gas in the world. It is bullying countries around the world to buy more LNG. It is also the largest expender, so not only does it produce more than anyone else, but it's planning to produce more and more. And it doesn't have the excuse of needing to develop its economy. The US is a tremendously rich country. So are Canada, Australia, Norway, and other oil and gas producers from the global north. So I think we need to really change the paradigm on this. China is doing comparatively much more than the US and many developed countries in trying to develop their economy with to decarbonize their economy. From a starting point that's very different. That's the thing. And let's also not forget about historical responsibility. China started emitting a lot of CO2 the past 20 years. The Europeans and the Americans have emitted a lot of CO2 for the past 100 or 150 years. So, let's not forget that.
Yeah. So you were on a panel earlier with Jean Su from the Center for Biological Diversity. It was fascinating. One of the things she said was, hey, it's actually kind of cool that the Trump administration didn't send anybody, because now we can do a really ambitious agreement, and then in 3.5 years, hopefully the next U.S. president will then start implementing it. We've heard several people talk like that, including Christiana Figueres. Do you think that's a realistic possibility, to get an ambitious agreement and then have the United States kind of hop back in after Donald Trump is gone?
Well, I think it's possible. It's happened before. But it's also true that the large breakthrough agreements that we've had in this process happen under fairly ambitious or progressive American administrations, whether Obama for the Paris Agreement or Biden for the Dubai Agreement on fossil fuels. So the diplomatic might of the United States could be very helpful in trying to find compromises. But with an administration like it is right now, like you have right now in the United States, it's probably better if they're not here, because they could play a really detrimental role in blocking these negotiations, like we've seen recently at the International Maritime Organization, where the US actually threatened countries who were about to sign a deal on decarbonizing the shipping sector. And the State Department actually threatened the countries with tariffs and economic sanctions if they would support that agreement. So yeah, I think it's better at this stage if the US is not in these rooms.
I know you got a lot to do, so last question here. That in the United States, the conversation is very different than it is here at COP. The latest polling shows most Americans don't even believe that human emissions of carbon dioxide are causing climate change, and even with the people who do, it's not really a high priority. How do you deal with the biggest, most powerful country in the world just not being interested in any of these things that other countries and other people are so concerned about?
To be frank, that's a question that the international climate community has been grappling with for the past 30 years. Because even under fairly progressive administrations, it's not like the US has ever been a beacon of progressive climate action on the global stage. But it's true that I think the US has a particular problem with climate misinformation and climate skepticism, etc. But it's not the only one. We're facing that problem across the board in many countries, in Europe, in Latin America, elsewhere, and President Lula of Brazil has made a big push on that, actually, trying to combat climate disinformation. So I think it's a very difficult question that we need to grapple with, and I think centering justice in this transition away from fossil fuels is also a way to get people back on board with the transition, because it's a lot harder to support the transition to renewable energy when the prospect is losing your job or not being supported or losing your livelihood. if there's money on the table to help communities around the world, that are going to be impacted by the move away from fossil fuels in particular, that's how you rebuild political support for the transition. That's how you get people on board with this. So I think opposing, justice and the transition is a really, really bad idea.
Excellent. And how do people learn more about your organization, Oil Change International?
Well, we have a website where we publish a lot of reports, a lot of research on who's responsible for oil and gas extraction. You can also find us on all the social media.
Very good. Well, man, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be back.